On December 5, 1945, Fort Lauderdale base lay under a windswept afternoon. On the runway, 5 TBM Avengers lined up neatly, ready for what should have been a routine training flight. Yet beneath the silent steel frames pulsed the heartbeats, breaths, and aspirations of 14 men, pilots, cadets, and technicians, about to face one of the most crucial trials of their military careers. According to the training logs, the Flight 19 crew consisted of one lead commander, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a seasoned aviator who had fought in the Pacific Theater and was entrusted with leading the squadron. 13 others, mostly young cadets in their early 20s, many of whom had never seen real combat. A few were technicians accompanying the flight to assist and observe, but the majority were students who still saw the sky as one vast classroom. The atmosphere was taut with preparation, yet tinged with excitement. Some cadets, flying the triangular navigation route for the first time, exchanged glances of both nerves and anticipation. They knew today's exercise would test the 3 core skills every naval pilot had to master: navigation, formation keeping, and long-distance flying. On the runway, technicians made final checks. Tanks full, radios live, compasses steady. Everything appeared flawless. The cadets strapped in, tightened harnesses, adjusted their bulky headsets. The Wright R-2600 engines roared to life, rattling the ground like a thunder orchestra. In the lead cockpit, Lieutenant Taylor tapped his flight log and map. "Training flight number 19, he announced over the intercom, "will last 2 to 3 hours. Treat this as a real battle. We take off, and we come back." His voice was stern but reassuring, anchoring the younger men's confidence. At 14:10 sharp, the takeoff signal was given. One by one, the massive Avengers lifted from the tarmac, carrying their heavy wings into Florida's sky. The squadron fell into line, heading eastward toward the Atlantic, leaving the base and coastline shrinking behind. That experience had molded him into a cautious yet decisive leader. After the war, he was reassigned as an instructor, charged with passing down lessons earned in blood to the next generation of naval aviators. By contrast, most cadets of Flight 19 were boys in their early 20s, fresh from basic training. They could work the controls, read gauges, use the compass and radio, but they had never felt the creeping dread of being lost at sea, nor flown hours on end with no land in sight. They carried book knowledge, but not yet the scars of real combat. One cadet, Rains, only 20, was nicknamed the Dreamer. Before enlisting, he had studied engineering and adored airplanes since childhood. For him, each flight was a chance to touch his dream. But his dreamy nature often left him careless with details, the sort of mistakes that, in war, could be fatal. Taylor had warned him more than once. "In the air, 1 minute without the clock and you lose everything." Another cadet, Lewis, a bit older than Rains, had logged only 14 hours of long-distance flying, far below the required standard. Quiet and disciplined, he followed orders to the letter, never questioning his commander. For him, if Taylor said turn east, he turned east. Such obedience was valued in the Navy, but it left little room for independent judgment. Among them were also a few technicians, silent figures tasked with observation and radio handling. They rarely drew notice, but their role as conduits of communication was vital to keeping order in the air. The contrast within Flight 19 was stark. One veteran commander against 13 untested youths. They were students, and Taylor their stern teacher. On that day, their fate hung on his clarity, composure, and commands. But therein lay the squadron's greatest vulnerability. Their total dependence on Taylor meant that when he himself became disoriented, when his compass began to fail, the entire formation spiraled into confusion. Not one cadet had the confidence or authority to break away, to try finding their own course. Sex, 0.056s and radio/observer, working together like gears in a complex machine. Across the formation, 14 lives were bound together by radio calls and by the commands coming from Taylor's lead plane. In Avenger 1, Taylor juggled both flying and command, issuing crisp orders over the radio. Every instruction was relayed to the other planes, where cadets hung on his words, fearful of missing a detail that might disrupt the whole formation. In Plane 2, young Raines sat sweating, eyes glued to compass and speed dial, snapping instantly to adjust controls whenever Taylor's voice came. "Hold altitude! Hold heading!" Behind him, the radio man strained to catch signals, while the gunner scanned the horizon for anomalies. In Plane 3, Lewis flew rigidly, his face stern. He never questioned, never hesitated, simply obeyed. His crew sometimes worried that his mechanical adherence could prove dangerous if quick judgment were needed. Yet, within military discipline, obedience was a strength. Together, the 5 Avengers spread into a V formation, an imposing sight against the sky and sea. From the ground, they were only specks, but in the air, their combined roar was thunder, evoking wartime squadrons surging into battle. But beneath this flawless choreography lurked fragility. Every movement, every decision of the squadron depended wholly on Taylor. If he commanded left, they all turned left. If he said, "Hold steady," they held steady. Their unity was strength, but it also stripped away independent thought. In earlier drills, when a cadet's compass faltered, he hadn't tried to solve it himself. He had simply reported to Taylor and waited. That was procedure, yes, but it also fostered dependency. When the moment came that Taylor himself faltered, none of them were prepared to take initiative. In his cockpit, Taylor bore the heavy weight of command. He knew 13 lives clung to his judgment. His orders weren't just directions, they were lifelines. These cadets had never felt the paralyzed. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, ocean winds swept in from the Atlantic across Fort Lauderdale base. On the runway, 5 TBM Avengers stood neatly aligned, ready for training flight 19. And at the center, in the cockpit of the lead plane, sat the man upon whom every gaze rested, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. Taylor was born in 1917 into a family with a military tradition. From his youth, he was captivated by the sky and longed to become a naval aviator. When World War II erupted, he quickly found himself deployed to the Pacific Front, where brutal naval battles raged between the U.S. Navy and the Japanese fleet. Throughout the war, Taylor flew dozens of torpedo and bombing missions. He had seen comrades never return, endured walls of anti-aircraft fire, and even survived when his own engine burst into flames in midair. These experiences forged him into a hardened soldier, no longer fearful of death, but deeply aware of how fragile a pilot's life could be. When the war ended, Taylor did not leave the service. He was assigned to Fort Lauderdale, an important training base, as an instructor. His mission was no longer to strike the enemy, but to shape and guide a new generation of naval aviators for whatever crises the post-war era might bring. To the cadets, Taylor was both stern and unshakable. Rarely did he smile. Behind his aviator glasses, his face remained serious. Yet every word carried weight. Those who had flown with him said he possessed a calm that bordered on coldness, even when compasses failed or radios went dead. That composure earned him the cadets' absolute trust. On that day, Taylor was more than an instructor. He was the very heart of the squadron. Upon his shoulders rested the lives of 13 young men, cadets with little experience, utterly reliant on his direction. He knew too well that a single mistake on his part could drag the entire squadron into disaster. Before takeoff, in the ready room, Taylor spread a map across the table and traced the 3 key legs. Taylor gripped the controls firmly, eyes fixed on the horizon. He did not yet know that this seemingly ordinary exercise would become an eternal reminder of the thin line between human will and the forces of nature, and that his name would forever be bound to the legend of Flight 19. To the young cadets, Lieutenant Taylor was not just a teacher, he was living proof of survival in war. Every story he told of the Pacific was a lesson carved from fire, commanding awe and fear alike. He had fought in battles such as the Philippine Sea, where hundreds of planes collided in skies aflame. He had once led a squadron diving low to launch torpedoes at a Japanese carrier as flak lit up the heavens. From those missions, he returned with scars invisible but indelible. Because of them, he understood better than anyone the power of calm, discipline, and navigation. Cadets recalled that Taylor often checked his compass and flight clock more than necessary. Each time he touched the compass glass, it was as though he were demanding a promise that it would not betray him. He would tell his men, "Your plane can take bullets, your engine can die, but if you lose your course, you are already dead. Out there, no one will reach you in time." That warning haunted many, but it was also a truth they memorized. Taylor's authority came not just from combat experience, but from his leadership style. He said little and acted much. Where some instructors lectured at length, Taylor issued short commands over the radio. "Hold altitude. Turn 10 degrees left. Maintain speed." The brevity gave his cadets reassurance. He always seemed in control. One cadet later recalled, "When I flew behind him, I always felt safe. Just by watching the tail of his Avenger, I knew I was on the right path." Their trust was nearly absolute. So absolute, in fact, that they never questioned his judgment. But therein lay the paradox. The more they trusted him, the less they thought for themselves. They made him their only compass, and when that compass faltered, they had no alternative. On that fateful, Taylor gripped the yoke and spoke into the radio. "Remember, nothing matters more than holding formation. Whatever happens, we return together." 13 voices heard him and silently pledged. They followed. They trusted. They never suspected that this very trust would lead them deeper into an enigma never solved. Taylor's Avenger cut through low clouds, the squadron behind him a V-shaped spear thrust into the fading sky. His stern face betrayed nothing, but inside, his mind ran a torrent of calculations, doubts, and memories. He knew the lives behind him hung on every order. In war, with enemy fire blazing, he could act decisively, and none would question him. But today, in deceptive calm, the greatest trap was silence itself. For just one wrong heading, one delayed correction, could carry them dozens of miles astray. Taylor glanced at the compass. The needle quivered faintly. Something amiss. He frowned, recalling times in the Pacific when magnetic interference had betrayed his instruments. He refused, however, to show alarm. Into the radio he barked, "Maintain east, hold altitude, continue course." Behind him, the cadets obeyed instantly. None asked why the compass trembled. None dared question the direction. To them, Taylor's word was law. In the cockpit's hum, only engine roar and radio static filled the air. Yet within Taylor's mind, a darker struggle stirred. He remembered 1944, when he had once led a squadron astray for 3 hours over the Pacific, drifting lost. Though they made it back, the void of that experience etched itself into his memory. Now, with the compass flickering again, the old ghost rose. He ordered another heading check. Results remained uncertain. Unease grew. Had the squadron flown too far? Had the winds pushed them off course? The more he thought, the deeper the doubt. Still, he did not voice his fears. To show worry would mean spreading panic, so he bore the burden alone. The sun set. In December 1945, America had just emerged from the nightmare of World War II. Across military bases, the air was both lighter with peace and urgent with the continued task of training, preparing for the new era. At Fort Lauderdale, a group of young aviation cadets were assigned to Training Flight 19, a mission that seemed simple but would become the most tragic legend in U.S. aviation history. Most of the 13 cadets in the squadron were men barely in their 20s, only recently out of school. They wore naval uniforms and carried the dream of mastering the skies, but their hearts still held the freshness of inexperience. To them, the TBM Avenger, massive torpedo bomber, was both a source of pride and a daunting challenge. Some had flown a few dozen hours of basic training, but most had never faced the vast ocean. For seasoned pilots, the sea was an invisible enemy, boundless, without anchor, without landmarks. For the young cadets, the sea was simply an endless blue streak below. They did not yet understand its terror. In the ready room before the flight, laughter mixed with the sound of notebooks flipping and maps being spread out. One cadet adjusted his flight helmet, another hid his tension with a clumsy joke. But behind the eagerness was a quiet dread. Would he be skilled enough to hold formation? Would he remember every radio check? Would he know what to do if the compass failed? What reassured them was the presence of Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, the combat-seasoned commander. They believed that as long as they followed his orders, everything would be fine. In their minds, Taylor was a living compass, the only guarantee amid the vast sky and sea. As they walked to the runway, the Atlantic wind whipped against their faces. 13 young cadets followed silently behind Taylor. In the pale late-afternoon sun, the image was that of a small band of men with great aspirations. None of them could have imagined that their youth and their absolute dependence on their leader would become a crucial part of the tragedy called Flight 19. When the TBM Avenger, some cadets noticed their compasses faltering. Needles jittered, sometimes veering a few degrees off, leaving them unsettled. One cadet called over the intercom, "Lieutenant, my compass is acting strange. Please confirm our heading?" Taylor's calm voice replied, "Stay with me. Do not change." The words soothed them briefly, but unease grew. Every cadet knew the compass was life itself over the ocean. If it failed, every calculation meant nothing. Yet, none dared argue, none dared adjust on their own. All eyes stayed on the lead plane. In plane number 2, Rains, the dreamer, bit his lip. He tried to believe Taylor was always right, but his gaze kept drifting down to the darkening sea. No islands, no markers, only waves upon waves. The more he looked, the more hollow he felt, as though the squadron was drifting into nothingness. In plane number 3, Lewis's hands sweated on the controls. He had never flown this far, never faced not knowing where he was. Though the radio still carried steady orders, a question gnawed at him. What if the commander is wrong? What if we're flying the wrong way? Doubt began to eat away at the confidence of these inexperienced cadets. Each time the compass needle wavered, their hearts jumped. They didn't know what else to do but cling to Taylor's commands. In the lead cockpit, Taylor felt the tension behind him, but he would not waver. He knew that if he admitted doubt, the squadron would collapse into chaos. So he kept his fears hidden, issuing only the familiar commands to maintain order. But his silence only deepened their confusion. They saw the compasses fail, heard static on the radio, watched the clouds thicken, while their leader gave no explanations. It was as if they were in a dark tunnel, forced to keep walking though no one knew what lay ahead. From their first eagerness, the cadets' mood shifted toward suspicion and fear. Some panted heavily, trying to calm themselves. Some bit their lips, unwilling to show panic. None had the skill to find position in a featureless ocean. None dared suggest breaking formation or flying a different course. To do so would be desertion in the sky. In plane number 2, Rains clutched the controls until his hands trembled. He stared at the compass spinning like a mad clock. "It's broken. It's broken," he muttered. But then Taylor's voice cut through. "Stop looking at it. Watch the formation. Hold distance." Rains drew a deep breath, forcing himself to believe that as long as he followed Taylor, everything would be fine. In plane number 3, Lewis stayed silent. The lessons echoed in his head. If lost, keep radio contact. Always trust your leader. He dared not doubt, dared not deviate. For him, obedience was salvation, but that obedience stripped away his independent judgment. Others fared no better. Some bent over their maps, but maps were meaningless without reference points. Some fiddled with radios, straining for a signal from base, but only static came. In the end, they all waited for Taylor's voice, and Taylor, in the lead cockpit, understood too well. His compass was failing, his radio weak, the sky around him turning darker by the minute. He was not certain they were on course, but he knew, if he showed hesitation, the cadets would fall into panic, so he chose to keep speaking calmly, even as his chest grew heavy. "Fly straight. Hold formation. Don't panic. We will make it back." The orders were like sedatives. The cadets clung to them as drowning men cling to a single raft. Their trust in Taylor became the fragile thread keeping the squadron together. But trust could not replace skill. The cadets were too inexperienced to realize that by following Taylor deeper into the murk, they were sinking further into the ocean's maze. They lacked the independence to stop, to check, to propose another course. They could only keep flying, like fledgling birds, wholly dependent on their leader, even as he flew them into the storm. When the 5 TBM Avengers of Flight 19 left the runway at Fort Lauderdale and gradually stabilized their altitude, a majestic sight appeared. The entire squadron moved in a V formation, like wild geese in the sky, but far more imposing and powerful. Amid the roar of engines, white trails stretched across the blue sky, forming a giant spear thrusting straight toward the sea. Inside each Avenger, 3 crew members performed their distinct yet tightly linked roles. The pilot held the controls, determined altitude and heading. The gunner scanned the surroundings, ready to man the rear turret if defense was needed. The radioman/navigator maintained communications, tracked maps, and assisted with navigation. 3 men in a cockpit, like 3 strings on an instrument, each different but needing to resonate together to create a single harmony. If one faltered, the entire plane was at risk. The coordination extended beyond each aircraft to encompass all 5 Avengers. Every movement followed the command of Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor in the lead plane. When he banked left, the squadron followed. When he dropped altitude, the others instantly adjusted. No one dared break formation. For in naval aviation, maintaining formation was a matter of survival. At first, this discipline gave an overwhelming sense of safety. The young cadets, though still inexperienced, felt sheltered inside an invisible shield. "We are one unit, no one left behind," one thought as he looked out the window, watching the sunlight glint off the steel wings of the Avenger flying beside him. In the cockpits, short exchanges echoed. "Maintain distance, 200 meters. Steady speed, 120 knots. Formation looks good, hold it." Though brief, these words carried a powerful sense of unity. No one was alone. Each aircraft was a link, joined into a steel chain slicing through the sky. But this absolute cohesion, so prized in naval squadrons, also carried within it the seed of tragedy. For if the lead plane strayed, all would stray. No one broke a... Inside each plane, the 3 crewmen worked almost by instinct. The pilot steady at the controls, the gunner scanning, the radioman reporting equipment status over the radio. Each Avenger was a closed little squad, and together the 5 formed a giant body, with Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor as its brain. This smoothness only deepened the cadets' trust in their commander. "As long as we follow him, we'll get back to base," one thought with relief. No one questioned whether they should double-check the heading. No one suspected the compass needles that jittered. They were too green to think otherwise, too trusting to dare doubt. But when the sky turned gray, clouds thickening to hide the horizon, this unity began to show its darker side. Some cadets noticed their compasses spinning erratically. Yet, instead of adjusting or comparing with reality, they simply reported to Taylor and waited. "Lieutenant, the compass isn't steady," a panicked voice came. "Just follow me. Hold formation," Taylor answered, curt and firm. That was enough to silence them. They stopped watching their instruments and focused only on the silhouette of the Avenger ahead. The tighter the formation, the less independence remained. Like birds in the night, if the leader strayed, the flock would follow into the abyss. In plane number 4, a young radioman named Matthews struggled with static, trying to catch Fort Lauderdale's signal. The bursts of noise made sweat bead on his forehead. He wanted to suggest turning back, but the eyes of his crewmates held him still. In the military, any doubt cast on the commander could be seen as insubordination. In plane number 5, Gunner Barnes strained his eyes into the mist, but saw nothing beyond fog and buffeting winds. He sighed. "If the commander says straight ahead, then we go straight ahead." His voice sounded resigned, yet it reflected the blind faith of the squadron. The deeper they flew into the ocean, the more their coordination became invisible shackles. None could break off. None could suggest another way. Each man was Sex 0.05. Flight 19 had only one path left, to follow their leader, even if that path led straight into endless night. Darkness cloaked the sea. The sun had vanished, leaving only a faint horizon, then gone entirely behind gray clouds. The 5 TBM Avengers still held their V formation, steel wings shuddering against the heavy Atlantic winds. From afar, they looked like a single steel mass, bound tightly together, plunging through the night. But their cohesion was now an invisible chain. In each cockpit, cadets saw clearly the strangeness. Compasses no longer reliable, radios fading in and out. Yet they had no right to choose for themselves. They could not break formation, could not suggest another heading. In the Navy, breaking formation meant breaking trust, and so they flew on, not because they knew the way, but because they had no choice. One radio man almost said, "What if we try west-southwest back to base?" but swallowed the words as Taylor's calm voice came through. "Keep heading. Hold formation. We'll be fine." Those words etched into their hearts like orders carved in stone. One cadet closed his eyes briefly, drew a long breath, and told himself, "The commander knows best. We just have to believe." In plane number 2, Rains still fixed his gaze on the tail of the Avenger ahead. His hands trembled on the stick, but he forced himself to fly close, not drifting from formation. Each time the red light on the tail blinked, he felt a flicker of hope. Lewis, in plane number 3, remained rigid and silent. He knew his inexperience, so obedience felt like survival. For him, absolute coordination was not a burden, but the only way to live. He thought, "If we stay together, we'll survive. If I break away, I'll die for sure." But in that silence, an unspoken truth grew clear. The squadron was lost. No one knew where they were. No one dared voice doubt. Coordination had turned to dependence. Unity had become the rope binding them. In military history, any squadron carries two faces: the strength of coordination and the danger of hidden weaknesses. With Flight 19, this duality became all the more evident. They had a seasoned commander, Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, but most of the others were young cadets with little real-world experience. That imbalance, combined with strict discipline, created a dangerous situation. If the leader erred, no one else was able or willing to correct it. Taylor had once been the squadron's absolute faith. He was the veteran, the role model for the young. Yet what the cadets did not realize was that even the most skilled leader could falter. In a sky clouded with mist, with compasses spinning and radios crackling with static, experience was no longer an invincible shield. The cadets were too inexperienced to recognize the danger. They had been trained to obey orders, maintain formation, and trust their superior. That discipline preserved order but stripped them of autonomy, a vital skill in emergencies. In the cockpits, as compasses wavered, some cadets sensed something was wrong. A few noticed the sky had turned pitch black, with no horizon. Others felt the wind shift and the sea grow rougher below. But instead of recalculating course or suggesting a return, they stayed silent and followed. None wished to be the one to break unity. This did not mean they lacked courage. On the contrary, they were brave men, ready to face danger. But their courage was confined within absolute faith in their commander. And when Taylor lost his bearings, the whole squadron fell into darkness. In the military, there is a concept called fatal dependency, when a group becomes so bound to one individual that no one can replace or challenge him. Flight 19 was the perfect example. They were like a giant ship with only one rudder, and when that rudder faltered, the ship drifted into the void. This lack of independence was an invisible flaw. No one saw it at takeoff. Everyone believed Flight 19's exercise would last 2 or 3 hours, well within control. But my needle's spinning. I can't get a heading. Taylor's voice answered, calm, firm as ever. Forget it. Follow me. Hold formation. His words were like steel orders, cutting through doubt. But in the cadets' hearts, unease deepened. They began to wonder silently, if even the commander was unsure, could they still be safe? In plane number 2, Rains stared at the Black Sea. No islands, no lights, only moonlit waves. He swallowed hard, wanting to say, maybe we've gone too far. but stayed quiet. He feared being seen as weak, or worse, as doubting his commander. Lewis, in plane number 3, felt the same. He knew they had flown too long in one direction, and fuel was dwindling. But when Taylor's voice came again, "Don't worry, we'll find Florida," he simply nodded unconsciously, clinging to belief. The squadron fell into a paradox. They sensed danger, yet none dared speak. Military discipline taught obedience. Faith kept them silent. Fear made them cling to Taylor's orders as their last lifeline. In plane number 4, Matthews, the radio man, nearly despaired at the static. He caught fragments of Fort Lauderdale's transmissions. "Return, southwest heading, repeat," but kept silent. To speak out would mean contradicting Taylor, so the vital message was lost in silence. The truth was harsh. Every cadet had noticed flaws in the orders, but all chose silence. They lacked not courage but the essential right, the right to decide. In the lead cockpit, Taylor bore the crushing weight. He knew they depended entirely on him. He also knew that if he admitted doubt, chaos would follow. So, though troubled inside, his voice stayed steady. "We'll fly a bit further. Hold formation." And so, the 5 Avengers flew on, deeper into the night. The cadets, full of doubt but voiceless, placed their lives entirely in Taylor's hands, and in doing so, locked shut their only door to survival. Night fell quickly, darkness swallowed 0.05 secs. If the commander says go, I'll go. I can't do otherwise. Matthews in plane number 4 caught faint words from Fort Lauderdale urging them to return, but he stayed silent. He feared disorder, and so the last hope dissolved into static. The night grew darker, fuel ran low, and Flight 19 pressed forward in their perfect V. The coordination that had been their pride now became their death sentence. If even one man had broken away, perhaps he might have found Florida's coast or a Bahamian island. But none did. In that moment, all 14 lives were bound together like gears in a broken machine, and when the main gear, Taylor, slipped, the whole system collapsed. Aviation history remembers Flight 19 not only for its mysterious disappearance, but for its painful lesson: the danger of absolute dependency. Brave but inexperienced, the cadets chose silence over dissent. They trusted their commander completely, even when their hearts screamed the course was wrong. And so, over the dark Atlantic, the 5 TBM Avengers vanished, leaving no trace, claimed not only by storm and sea, but by the fatal weakness of blind obedience.